A Muslim man threw a statue of the Virgin Mary into an American river, and what followed stunned an entire city. Los Angeles, spring 2025. Morning light spilled over the concrete banks of the LA River as joggers, dog walkers, and weekend cyclists passed without noticing the tension gathering on a pedestrian bridge. A man stood still at the railing, gripping a small white statue, the Virgin Mary, her hands folded, her face calm. Within seconds, the statue would be gone. And within weeks, nothing in this neighborhood would be the same. From the sidewalk below, an older woman paused mid-step. She had come to light a candle at a modest outdoor shrine near Street Bridget's church, a place where widows whispered prayers and tired grandparents found a moment of peace. She sensed something was wrong before she saw it. Others felt it too, a tightening in the chest, a hush that fell without command. The man on the bridge was Khalil Rahman, 43, a Muslim shop owner known for keeping to himself. To some, he was a hard-working father carrying the weight of a city that never fully welcomed him. To others, he was the neighbor who had grown sharp lately, bristling at symbols he felt were closing in on his family. In his hand, the statue felt heavier than stone heavy, with arguments, insults, fears left unsaid. A few steps away, Grace Donovan, a volunteer who spent her days bridging faiths and feeding the hungry, recognized the look in Khalil's eyes. Not anger alone, something fractured beneath it. She called out, softly. Too late. The statue slipped from Khalil's fingers and fell. It struck the water with a muted splash and vanished into the slow brown current. Phones lifted. A gasp rippled across the bridge. Someone whispered, "Oh no." Someone else said nothing at all. Khalil expected relief. Instead, an emptiness opened inside him, sudden and cold. Below, the older woman pressed a hand to her heart, as if something precious had been taken from her. Not wood or plaster, but hope. Grace stared at the water, stunned, already sensing the consequences would not belong to one man alone. By nightfall, stories would spread first as outrage, then as rumor. By week's end, they would turn into testimonies no one could easily explain. And by the time the city paid attention, the question would no longer be why the statue was thrown, but how an act meant to erase a symbol became the beginning of something no one could control. Khalil Rahman was not known as a troublemaker. In Boyle Heights, most people knew him as the quiet owner of a narrow corner grocery that opened before sunrise and closed long after dark. To some, he was the man who always stocked halal meat when others wouldn't. To others, he was simply the neighbor who kept his head down and paid his bills on time. Few would have guessed that the man on the bridge that morning carried a storm inside him. Those close to Khalil saw the change long before the river incident. Customers noticed his patience thinning. Regulars heard irritation creep into his voice when the conversation turned to the neighborhood's shifting identity. Khalil felt surrounded by symbols he did not choose, traditions he did not understand, and expectations he believed were silently aimed at his family. In his mind, these were not harmless signs of faith. They were reminders that he and his loved ones would always be outsiders. At home, the pressure was constant. His wife Amina moved through the apartment carefully, aware of how easily Khalil's silence could turn into sharp words. Their son, Yusuf, 16, had stopped talking about school altogether. Khalil noticed the bruises before he heard the excuses. Each night, he lay awake convinced that if he did not draw a line, the world would draw it for him. From Khalil's perspective, the small shrine outside Street Bridget's church was not about prayer. It felt like a declaration. One more signal that his neighborhood was slipping beyond his control. He told himself that removing the statue was not hatred, but protection. Not violence, but correction. A way to push back against a fear he did not yet know how to name. Across the street, Grace Donovan watched Khalil from a distance. She had seen that look before, in different cities, on different faces. It was the look of a man who believed strength meant never bending. Grace sensed that Khalil was not driven by cruelty, but by a desperate need to reclaim dignity in a place where he felt increasingly invisible. What no one could see, least of all Khalil, was how thin the line had become between defense and destruction. His motive seemed simple on the surface, to make a statement, to silence a symbol. But beneath it lay a deeper hunger, one that would soon be answered in a way Khalil could never have imagined. The roots of Khalil Rahman's anger did not begin with a statue or a church. They began at his own kitchen table, in the quiet moments when his family pretended everything was fine. Khalil had crossed an ocean years earlier, believing hard work would be enough. For a long time, it was. But in recent years, something shifted, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. His son Yusuf used to speak eagerly about school. Now he answered questions with shrugs. Khalil noticed the way Yusuf avoided eye contact, the way he changed clothes quickly after coming home. One afternoon, Amina found a torn sleeve and a faint bruise near her son's wrist. Yusuf brushed it off as an accident, but the truth surfaced later in fragments: mockery in the hallway, whispers about his name, jokes about his mother's hijab. Nothing dramatic enough to report, yet sharp enough to wound. For Khalil, each story felt like a personal failure. He had promised Amina that America would be different, that their son would belong. Instead, Khalil felt watched, judged, tolerated rather than accepted. He began to interpret ordinary moments as threats. Long stares at the grocery counter, a customer's silence, a neighbor's passing remark. Whether real or imagined, the weight of it pressed down on him daily. Amina carried her pain quietly. She prayed at night when Khalil thought she was asleep, asking not for protection, but for peace in her husband's heart. She saw what Khalil could not admit, that his fear was turning inward, hardening into resentment. He no longer spoke of patience or trust. He spoke of lines, boundaries, and respect. In Khalil's mind, faith became armor. Anything outside it felt dangerous. Symbols he did not recognize took on exaggerated power, as if they were pushing his family further to the margins. He did not hate the people around him, but he feared losing himself and his son in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent. What Khalil could not see was that his pain had begun to speak louder than his love. The wound he carried was not only from how others treated his family, but from the crushing belief that he alone had failed to keep them safe. And that wound, still raw and unnamed, was guiding his actions toward a moment that would force it into the open. Just a few blocks from Khalil Rahman's store stood Street Bridget's Church, a modest brick building that most people passed without a second glance. Yet every morning, before traffic thickened and the city fully woke, a small circle of elderly women gathered there. They came slowly, leaning on canes or one another's arms, carrying rosaries worn smooth by decades of prayer. To them, this place was not about tradition or debate. It was about survival. Among them was Rosa Martinez, 67, a widow who had buried her husband 5 years earlier and now raised her granddaughter while her daughter worked double shifts. Arthritis stiffened Rosa's hands, and loneliness settled into her bones more deeply than the pain. Each morning, she stopped before a simple outdoor shrine, a small statue of the Virgin Mary, hands open, face gentle, and whispered the same prayer, for strength to endure another day without bitterness. To Rosa, Mary was not an idea or a doctrine. She was a mother who understood loss. When Rosa spoke to her, she was not replacing God, but reaching for comfort in a world that had taken too much. The shrine had become a quiet refuge for many like her, women over 50, who carried grief with dignity and rarely spoke of it aloud. From across the street, Khalil sometimes noticed the gathering. What Rosa experienced as consolation, he perceived as something else entirely. He did not see widows seeking peace. He saw a symbol that seemed to mark territory. The same object held two radically different meanings, shaped by lives that had never truly intersected. Father Michael O'Connor, the parish priest, was aware of the tension but underestimated its depth. He encouraged openness, reminding parishioners to pray for their neighbors, not against them. Yet even he did not realize how closely the fragile calm of the neighborhood depended on understanding that had not yet formed. On one particular morning, Rosa lingered longer than usual. Her hands ached, her heart felt heavy, and she sensed an unease she could not name. She pressed her fingers to the base of the statue and closed her eyes. In the quiet, she asked Mary to watch over the neighborhood, to soften hearts she would never meet, and to protect families she did not know. Unaware of it, Rosa's simple prayer was already brushing against a storm that would soon pull her into a story far larger than her own. The spark that turned unease into open conflict did not come from the church steps or the grocery counter. It came from words careless, incomplete, and passed from mouth to mouth until they no longer resembled the truth. In a neighborhood already carrying unspoken tension, misunderstanding found fertile ground. It began with Yusuf. One afternoon, He returned home unusually quiet, his shoulders tense, his eyes fixed on the floor. Later that evening, fragments of the story emerged. A joke in the hallway, a comment about his name, someone mimicking his mother's accent. Nothing violent enough to trigger alarms, yet sharp enough to lodge deep. By the time the story reached Khalil, it had already grown teeth. Across the street, a different version was circulating. A parishioner at Street Brigades mentioned that a Muslim shop owner was angry about the shrine and had threatened to complain. The words were never spoken exactly that way, but they spread anyway. Fear reshaped them. Soon Rosa heard whispers that the man from the grocery store wanted the statue removed. To her, it sounded like an attack on the only place she felt truly seen. When Khalil confronted a neighbor outside his store, his frustration spilled out clumsily. He spoke of respect, of boundaries, of how his family felt cornered. The neighbor heard accusation. The neighbor replied defensively. A passerby overheard fragments and filled in the blanks. By nightfall, sides had formed without a single honest conversation taking place. Grace Donovan sensed the fracture widening. She tried to slow the narrative, reminding people that pain often disguises itself as anger, but her voice struggled to rise above the noise. Online comments hardened positions further, reducing real lives to labels and assumptions. Rosa, who had never spoken to Khalil directly, prayed that evening with trembling hands. She asked for protection, convinced that something sacred was under threat. Khalil, pacing his apartment, replayed Yusuf's humiliation and felt a familiar surge of helpless rage. Each believed they were defending what mattered most. Neither realized how much the other was already hurting. By the time the sun rose again, the neighborhood was no longer simply divided by belief. It was divided by words that cut deeper than any action yet taken. And those words were quietly steering everyone toward a moment that would change them all. In the middle of the growing tension stood Grace Donovan, a woman most people barely noticed until they needed her. At 60, Grace had the calm posture of someone who had learned to listen more than she spoke. 3 mornings a week, she coordinated food distribution near the river. On Sundays, she rotated between churches, mosques, and community centers, believing that hunger and loneliness ignored religious labels. Grace had watched the neighborhood change slowly, then all at once. She noticed Khalil's clenched jaw when conversations turned sharp. She noticed Rosa's hands shaking more than usual as she prayed. To Grace, the warning signs were clear. This was no longer about faith. It was about fear, looking for a target. The day before the incident, Grace crossed paths with Khalil outside his store. She did not accuse him or lecture him. She simply asked how his family was doing. Khalil hesitated, then spoke too much, too fast about Yusuf, about disrespect, about feeling pushed aside in his own neighborhood. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said only one thing. When pain doesn't feel heard, it looks for a symbol to fight. Later that afternoon, Grace stopped by Street Brigades. She found Rosa arranging candles near the shrine, her movements slow and deliberate. Grace mentioned the tension gently, urging caution. That statue, she said softly, means hope to you. But to someone else it might feel like a wall. Please pray for the man, not just the shrine. Rosa nodded, though unease flickered across her face. Grace left both conversations unsettled. She sensed a decision forming somewhere she could not reach. That evening, she stood by the river longer than usual, watching the current pull debris downstream. She remembered other neighborhoods, other conflicts, where a single, impulsive act had ignited wounds no one knew how to heal. On the morning everything broke, Grace recognized Khalil immediately on the bridge. The look in his eyes confirmed her fear. She called out to him, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be heard. Khalil, she said, whatever you're about to do won't take the pain away. He paused, just for a second. It was not enough. Grace would later replay that moment endlessly, wondering if a different word, a firmer tone, or an earlier warning could have changed the outcome. But in that instant, all she could do was watch as the fragile line between restraint and regret quietly snapped. The moment arrived without music or warning. It unfolded in plain daylight, surrounded by ordinary people who had no idea they were about to witness the turning point of a neighborhood story. Khalil Rahman stood at the center of the pedestrian bridge, the statue of the Virgin Mary cradled awkwardly in his hands. Up close, it was smaller than it looked from a distance white plaster, chipped at the base, smoothed by years of weather and touch. To some it was sacred. To Khalil, it had come to represent every fear he could no longer contain. A couple slowed their pace. A teenager lifted a phone, sensing something unusual. Below them, the river moved lazily, indifferent to human meaning. Grace Donovan reached the bridge breathless, her voice cutting through the murmur. "Khalil," she said again, this time closer. "Please, this won't heal what's broken." Her words landed, but they could not disarm the storm already decided inside him. Khalil's hands trembled, not with rage, but with hesitation. For a brief second, memory flooded in. Yusuf's bruised silence, Amina's tired eyes, the weight of being unseen. He told himself this was necessary. A line had to be drawn. A message had to be sent. "This ends today," he said. Not to Grace, not to the crowd, but to himself. He stepped forward and released the statue. The Virgin Mary tilted once in the air, sunlight flashing across her face, then dropped. The sound was small, barely more than a dull splash, but it landed heavily on everyone who heard it. The statue disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the current. A gasp rippled across the bridge. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else cursed under their breath. Phones rose higher. No one spoke to Khalil directly. He waited for relief. Instead, a hollow ache spread through his chest, sharp and unexpected. It felt as though something essential had slipped away with the statue, leaving him exposed. Grace stared at the water, one hand pressed to her mouth. She did not shout. She did not accuse. Her silence carried more weight than anger ever could. Down the street, at Street Brigades, Rosa Martinez would soon feel a sudden tightness in her chest, unable to explain why. By nightfall, the story would travel faster than the river itself. And though it looked like an ending, the truth was far stranger. This single act of rejection had just opened a door no one on that bridge knew existed. The hours after the incident did not bring closure. They brought silence, heavy, intrusive, and impossible to escape. Khalil Rahman returned to his store and went through the motions of the day, but nothing felt solid anymore. The bell above the door rang. Customers spoke. Change passed from hand to hand. Yet inside him, something had gone numb. That night, sleep refused to come. Each time Khalil closed his eyes, he saw the statue falling. Not as an object, but as a face turning away. The river's muted splash replayed in his ears like an accusation. He had expected to feel strong. Instead, he felt exposed, as if he had torn something open and discovered it could not be closed again. Across the neighborhood, Rosa Martinez woke before dawn with an unfamiliar sensation. The stiffness in her hands, the pain that usually greeted her every morning, had eased. She flexed her fingers slowly, afraid to believe it. For years, even small movements had cost her effort. Now, the pain seemed to retreat without explanation. She whispered a hesitant prayer, unsure whether to thank God or simply remain silent. Nearby, another woman experienced a different shift. Elena Cruz, who had battled insomnia and anxiety since her husband's death, slept through the night for the first time in months. She would later describe it not as happiness, but as peace. A quiet settling of the heart she had forgotten was possible. By afternoon, small stories began circulating. Someone mentioned a sudden calm. Someone else spoke of relief from a long-standing ache. No one connected the dots yet, but the timing unsettled those who noticed. Father Michael O'Connor listened carefully, writing names in a small notebook, reminding himself not to rush to conclusions. Grace Donovan felt the weight of it all most acutely. She stood by the river again, staring at the place where the statue had disappeared. She did not feel anger toward Khalil, only a growing sense that something had been set in motion beyond human intention. Khalil, unaware of the whispers spreading around him, carried his emptiness like a secret. The act he believed would restore control had instead stripped it away. And as the first unexplainable changes quietly surfaced, one truth began to form beneath the confusion. Whatever had been thrown into the water, something far greater was beginning to rise. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to change in ways no one could neatly explain. The stories did not arrive all at once. They surfaced quietly, like ripples spreading outward from the river. At Street Brigades, Rosa Martinez returned for morning prayer, expecting the familiar ache to return. It didn't. By the end of the week, she was opening jars without wincing, walking longer distances without stopping to rest. Her doctor would later shake his head at the scans and use words like unexpected improvement. Rosa chose different words. She said only that the heaviness had lifted. Across the street, reconciliation took an even stranger form. A man named Daniel Price, sober only 2 weeks after 20 years of drinking, showed up at the church kitchen asking to volunteer. He told Grace Donovan that something inside him had shifted after hearing about the statue in the river. "I don't know why," he admitted, "but I felt like I'd been spared when I didn't deserve it." Families began repairing what had been broken. A father and daughter who hadn't spoken since a bitter argument found themselves sitting together at a park bench, talking without anger. A couple on the brink of separation canceled their appointment with a divorce lawyer after a night they described as unusually peaceful. The most unsettling report came from the local children's hospital. Lily Hernandez, 8 years old, born with a heart condition that required constant monitoring, showed test results her cardiologist could not reconcile with her history. The numbers were better dramatically so. Further tests were ordered. The word miracle was not spoken aloud, but it hovered in every conversation. Father Michael listened, cautious but attentive. Grace watched connections form where none had existed before. People who had once avoided one another now exchanged greetings, then conversations, then shared meals. The atmosphere softened, as if an invisible barrier had thinned. Only one person remained untouched by relief. Khalil Rahman moved through these same streets feeling increasingly displaced. While others spoke of healing and peace, he felt a growing pull inward, a sense that the changes unfolding around him were somehow tied to his act, yet no longer belonged to him. What looked like coincidence to some began to feel like invitation to others. Healing, reconciliation, and return were unfolding side by side. And slowly, unmistakably, the neighborhood began to realize that something beyond human design was at work, something calling hearts back to one another. The breaking point did not come in daylight. It came in the quiet hours before dawn, when defenses weaken and truth slips through unguarded places. Khalil Rahman fell asleep near morning, exhaustion finally overpowering restlessness. In his dream, he stood again by the river, but the bridge was empty. The city hushed. The water was clear this time, reflecting a soft, unearthly light. On the riverbank stood a woman clothed in blue, her presence calm rather than commanding. She did not accuse. She did not reach for the water. She looked at Khalil with a sorrow that felt intimate, almost maternal. She spoke no words Khalil could hear, yet her meaning pressed into him unmistakably. What you tried to push away was never against you. Then beyond her, a warmth appeared steady, inviting, drawing the eye not to her but past her. Khalil woke with tears on his face and a weight on his chest he could not explain. That same morning, Grace Donovan found Khalil sitting alone on a bench near the river, staring at the water as if expecting it to answer him. She hesitated before approaching, unsure whether he would pull away again. This time, he didn't. "I can't sleep," Khalil said quietly. "I thought I was ending something, but it feels like I started something I don't understand." Grace listened. She did not interpret the dream or offer conclusions. She asked one question instead. What if this isn't about being right, but about being led somewhere you didn't expect? Later that day, Khalil agreed to meet Father Michael O'Connor at Street Brigades. The meeting was brief and tense at first. Khalil did not justify his actions. He named them. He did not demand forgiveness. He asked whether peace was still possible. Father Michael answered carefully. "Some at times," he said. "The moment we resist most is the moment we are closest to being changed." As Khalil left the church, the city felt unfamiliar, as if he were walking through a place he had lived in for years but never truly seen. The dream lingered, not as an image to explain, but as a summons he could no longer ignore. Something had reached him, not to condemn, but to call him forward. Khalil Rahman knew that silence was no longer an option. Whatever had begun at the river demanded an answer, and that answer would cost him pride, reputation, and the fragile armor he had worn for years. On a quiet weekday afternoon, he walked back to Street Brigades Church, not as an observer, but as a man prepared to be seen. Word spread quickly. Some came out of curiosity, others out of anger. A few came because they had prayed for this moment without believing it would ever arrive. Khalil stood before Father Michael O'Connor, his hands empty, his shoulders tense. He spoke plainly. He did not blame fear, misunderstanding, or circumstance. He named the act for what it was. He admitted that throwing the statue had not protected his family. It had exposed his brokenness. Then he asked for forgiveness without conditions. The hardest moment came when Rosa Martinez stepped forward. The room went still. Khalil turned toward her, his voice barely steady as he apologized. Not for the controversy, but for the pain. He acknowledged what the shrine had meant to her and others like her, and how his anger had stripped dignity from something sacred to them. Rosa did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her words were simple and costly. She said forgiveness did not erase fear, but it refused to let fear rule. If the Virgin Mary is a mother, she said, then she does not teach us to destroy one another. Khalil accepted the consequences that followed. He agreed to speak publicly, knowing the story would not flatter him. He faced criticism from his own community and suspicion from those he had hurt. His store lost customers before it gained any back. Apologies, he learned, do not heal instantly. They open wounds before they close them. Grace Donovan watched as the room exhaled. What unfolded was not resolution, but conversion in its rawest form, truth spoken aloud, shame carried without defense, and a man choosing humility over control. By the end of the day, Khalil left the church lighter and more exposed than ever. He had not fixed what he broke, but he had taken the first step toward becoming someone who no longer needed to break things to feel whole. What began as a public scandal did not end with a verdict or a headline. It ended as something quieter and far more enduring. In the weeks after Khalil Rahman's apology, the neighborhood did not return to what it had been. It became something new. Street Brigade's church opened its doors on weekday evenings, not just for mass but for shared meals. Members of the local mosque came with trays of food. Elderly Catholic women sat beside Muslim families they had once passed without a glance. Conversations replaced suspicion. Grace Donovan helped organize the first interfaith gathering by the river. There were no speeches, no debates, only candles, prayers offered in different languages, and a moment of silence for wounds both seen and unseen. Where the statue had vanished into the water, they laid white roses instead, not to replace what was lost, but to mark what had been found. Khalil never positioned himself as a hero. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was only to repeat the same truth, that fear had made him blind, and humility had begun to restore his sight. Slowly, trust returned. His store filled again, not just with customers, but with conversations. Yusuf laughed more easily. Amina slept through the night. Rosa Martinez became an unexpected symbol of the transformation. Her healing continued, but she spoke less about her body and more about her heart. I learned, she told others, that Mary does not belong to one group. A mother gathers, she does not divide. Her words carried weight because they were lived, not argued. Even Father Michael noticed the shift. Attendance at church changed, not larger, but deeper. People came seeking reconciliation more than certainty. The local imam attended one gathering and said quietly, "This is what faith looks like when it heals instead of harms." The river still flowed as it always had. The statue was never recovered. Yet its absence became a reminder that faith does not need stone to move hearts. What mattered was the bridge built where division once stood, a bridge of listening, repentance, and unexpected grace. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Not that people were healed, but that enemies learned to call one another neighbors. If this story of transformation, humility, and grace touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel Touched by Mary. Here, we share stories that remind us how love can still unite what the world tries to divide.